The Crisis States program went for 10 years. The first 5 years I looked at local level issues and how international crisis and change impacted on communities and the local, very local level, micro level analysis. And the second 5 years, we upscaled our lens to looking at cities and the metropolitan arena and scale. So what I'm presenting today is the result of 5 rather than 10 years' work. And for some of you who came to a lecture I gave at UCT a few years ago when we were just embarking on this work, some of the early part of this paper will be familiar, because what I did at that lecture was to present the analytical framework that we drew out of the literature review. What I'm presenting today is the findings out of the empirical research, but I'll have to say a little bit about the analytical framework as well. So what we did in trying to challenge both the whole notion of state fragility, failed states, crisis states, is we tried to look at the conditions under which states get into difficulty. And now the debate has moved on much more to talk about fragile situations, or states in fragile situations. When we started, we were still talking about state fragility. We'd probably shift that now. And so one thing was to challenge conventional notions about so-called failed states. The other was to get into a conversation, a debate with colleagues working at the national and international level, to force them to think at different scales and to put into conversation our work at the city level with their work at the national level. And in order to do this, we took as our linchpin, as our analytical starting point, the work of Charles Tilley, the late Charles Tilley, who was a historical sociologist and who studied state formation in early modern Europe. And what Tilley argued was that power holders seeking to fight wars in order to consolidate territory and form states had to form relationships with urban elites. And they had to do this because urban elites were the ones who could fund the armies. So there was a very tight relationship that was developed between urban elites and medieval lords in the process of state-making in Europe historically. And the interaction between cities, wars and states critically shaped European history, resulting in the triumph of the modern bureaucratic nation-state over other forms of polity. So our starting point was, why did such a relationship not take place in those parts of the world, of the contemporary world, that we might see are challenged by conditions of fragility. And our research across Latin America, Africa and Asia has shown that in the contemporary developing world, the relationship between cities, states and war is much more complex. With the decline of conventional forms of warfare, we need to look at violent conflict in a much more nuanced and multifaceted way than in sovereign wars fought for territory. And more than that, Tilley's analytical model doesn't time travel very well and proved too blunt an instrument for us to use, except as something to think with. And this is because cities have changed, the international context of political decision-making has changed, and the conflict itself has changed. But his project remains an important element of our rubric, because it allowed us to ask these penetrating questions about the relationship between cities and states and war. We conclude that adequately understanding contemporary state fragility in the rapidly urbanizing developing world isn't possible without an understanding of the way that cities are incorporated into violent conflict. Paradoxically, while historically urban areas have been seen at the forefront of state-making, across much of the developing world, they've also become primary sites of state erosion and crisis. And this is a fact that's often obscured by a concentration of both national wealth and state organization in cities, and by the prevalence of the urban bias thesis. So we begin by touching briefly on the way in which cities, states and conflict have changed since the period of European state formation, highlighting the characteristics of cities and states in the parts of the world where fragility prevails. We then outline our tripartite typology of contemporary conflicts, and this bit will be familiar to those of you who were at the previous talk, where we distinguish between sovereign, civil and civic conflicts, capturing their most salient aspects. And then drawing on our case study research, and Jason Sumich is here in the room, did our case study on Mozambique, case studies on Mozambique and Maputo, drawing on his and the work of a large team working across 3 continents. We explore the different ways in which cities are incorporated into these different forms of conflict, either as targets, as spaces of relative security, what one of our partners, Antonio Gustosi, talks about as the eye of the storm, where you have a raging conflict and cities are the eye of the storm within it. And a third form, civic conflict, and I'll explain these. We started off, as we engaged in the literature around this, in debate, and in particular, Dennis Rogers, myself, and Tom Goodfellow argued with each other in papers. So in 2007, I wrote a paper called, and that was taking up the iconic idea of Eric Wolff, who talked about peasant wars of the 21st century, and argued that, of the 20th century, and argued that in the 21st century we would be seeing urban wars. And I refer to a broad spectrum of urban conflict ranging from terrorist attacks to sovereign air raids and through to more local level encounters. In conversation with this paper, Dennis Rogers wrote one called Slum Wars of the 21st Century, where he advanced the argument, saying that violent conflicts such as gang warfare and urban crime, although usually considered forms of social violence, can actually be seen as deeply political in nature. And as such, they constitute a continuation of peasant wars by other means and in new spatial settings. So he was arguing that the political nature of peasant wars simply spilled into cities, and that in turn, the urban context gave them a new form. In reply to that, I then wrote a paper on the paradoxes of urban conflict, in which I tried to look at why it is that someone like David Harvey talks about conflict as constructive and destructive, that all cities are built on conflict and this is a good thing, and if you don't have contestation, you don't have social change. But on the other hand, when that becomes destructive, for which we violent, it can undermine that. And so I explored that paradox. And then Tom Goodfellow, in his study of Kampala, which was one of the case studies for our program, set out to explain why in a city relatively blessed by a lack of violent conflict, there was institutional gridlock and apparent lack of interest in the city, and a lack of interest in urban institutions by political coalitions, and that this was negatively impacting on a constructive, engaged urban politics, and was detrimental to urban planning. So taken together, these questions and contributions provided the framework for thinking about urban political conflict, its descent into violence, its relationship to other forms and loci of conflict, and the significance of socio-economic and spatial characteristics of cities. I think it's worth just fleshing out a little bit more before I move on to looking at conflict itself, why Tilly doesn't time travel well. His whole argument is based on these urban elites, who are ultimately the taxpayers, on the back of which wars were fought and states were built, how these urban elites had an autonomy by virtue of their control over capital accumulation. And what you find in Africa, for example, as Herbst has argued, but in many of the other contexts that we've looked at, is that that autonomy was missing for urban elites, because urban elites actually became elites on the back of the state, not on the back of their autonomy from the state. So pre-colonial cities were by and large quite small. Under colonialism, existing cities took on new functions, mostly related to facilitating the extraction of resources and military protection of colonial regimes. They were central to colonial state building, yet they lacked the autonomy that European urban elites historically exercised in their negotiation with coercive powers. In other words, the subordination of cities to states, which Tilly contended occurred over a very long period of dynamic interaction in Europe, was in place from the very beginning of the colonial encounter. So rapid urbanization proceeded with neither an autonomous urban capitalist class nor an industrial working class that could challenge the state. And that underpins a lot of the analysis of conflict as we see it. The other thing is that states today are very different. What Tilly was arguing is that states were contesting territory and borders. They were trying to form. Whereas today, most international borders are fixed. The principle of national sovereignty has been established. Borders between states are to a great extent protected internationally, with the effect that states don't need to consolidate their internal territorial power and legitimacy in quite the same way. Having said that, theories that anticipate the retreat of the state, accompanying discourses on globalisation, have been largely discredited, although few would deny that relations between states and controllers of capital have changed dramatically as the international economy has become increasingly integrated. What remains familiar from Tilly's time to now is that contemporary elites continue to seek beneficial arrangements with those controlling access to resources and capital. These arrangements are often with international forces, aid, trade, and so on, very much growing out of the Cold War, are often based on alliances that in turn are based on patronage-type relationships. And so the Tillian state-making dynamic between domestic coercion and domestic capital is fundamentally broken in contemporary states, largely because of the dominance of a global and international economy. The last big difference is that conflict has changed, and especially in recent decades. The wars that Tilly observed were fought between medieval sovereigns, and once states, systems began crystallizing between governments of consolidated states. The fact that interstate warfare has been in decline for some decades now has generally been acknowledged, and many commentators tend to see this decline as being accompanied by a rise in civil wars or intra-state wars. This has been noted by the International Red Cross and many other observers of war. As more time has elapsed since this was observed in the late 1990s, early 2000s, however, it's become apparent that claims of a radical increase in civil wars across the world is incorrect, and has tended to obscure the fact that according to some empirical studies, both inter- and intrastate wars are in decline, lessening by nearly half in the decade after the Cold War. So since the early 1990s, civil wars as well have declined sharply. And what we argue in the paper is that as sovereign wars decline and civil wars decline, the impact of those wars and what happens after has led to an increase in urban conflict, and I'll explain the connection as we go. So our purpose is not to provide definitive proof that urban conflict is on the rise, but rather to explore the critical role played by cities in relation to changing forms of violent conflict, including